Hi, hello, welcome to Spell Day. We're covering a spell every single day of the year from the 5e PHB plus 3. Those specialty spells are homebrew spells. You can head back in the playlist to find them. Today's spell is water breathing.
In water, chimps will drown.
Third level transmutation, Ritual. Casting time of 1 action, range of 30 feet, components herbal somatic material, a short reed, or piece of straw. Duration 24 hours. The spell grants up to 10 willing creatures you can see within range the ability to breathe underwater until the spell ends. Affected creatures also retain their normal mode of respiration. Okay, so that chuckle at the start, this spell. Simple description, really, and it's quite well. I mean, third level, NPC-wise, a bit of a take. It's fighting for spaces like Fireball when it comes to players, but ritual casting? So the actual cost of the spell slot is really only for the learned component of it, and then outside of that, the material component isn't consumed, it doesn't have a gold cost, it's just, you know, the classic reed snorkel. 24 hours and no concentration, and even in a pinch, you could just cast as an action. Up to 10 creatures, range of 30 feet. Not that bad. 24-hour duration is really good, alongside keeping the normal form of respiration, so can't cast this outside of combat, and then have people surface drown. Player-wise, not bad. It gives you access to the water level, because, you know, we all love water levels. Water levels in video games are already a thing in themselves, just because the whole thing is like slowing down your movement to some extent, or giving you a different moveset. It's an environment not like the rest of the game, which is part of its difficulty, but most of the time, if not done well, just comes to annoyance. In a tabletop RPG, where you're working on just a map, in three-dimensional spaces with flying and multiple levels of terrain is already difficult, throwing in water to that is a whole other thing. But now world-building-wise. Oh, world-building-wise. Okay. It's a ritual. It's third level, not concentration, lasts 24 hours. If you did want to, like, as a player or just a random NPC, try to get the maximum amount of people possible, it's only 10 minutes. Lasts 24 hours. You could get a huge group of people that were going for only a few hours dive. It depends the entire length of time they're heading down there. You don't need to use up the full 24 hours. You can't, like, use the 10 minutes for the ritual cast. Sorry, you could only do one group because this dive's only gonna take 23 hours and a little over. No. If a dive, like, just off a coastline is, like, for pearl divers and such, it's only going to take a few hours, and pearl divers are really efficient. Not to the point of a few hours, but real-life pearl divers are quite fast and hold their breath for a long amount of time. Giving them the ability to just breathe water, even for only a few hours, if you did this to hundreds of them, yeah, you could do hundreds. 10 per 10 minutes, lasts for 24 hours, yeah. Pearl diving industry will just boom. Or maybe crash. But that's one big thing. I mean, in modern history, the equivalent of having a diving suit is relatively recent in the grand scheme of things. And even with modern day diving suits, 24 hours? And it's actually just modifying the creature to allow them to breathe underwater. It's not having them need a tank. It's not a fuel source. It's not mechanics that can then break down. It's just a spell. It's magic. But now I have questions, because of course I do. As with a good amount of spells that only leave a small description, if it's not just one simple mechanic, it ripples out. In this one, water breathing. Namely, or kind of, the mechanics of breathing. And water. And, okay. So hypothetically, congrats, you have water breathing. Does it, like, allow you to just breathe air underwater? Are you breathing in the water because you can still breathe air? It's not like Alter Self, which gives you gills? Because depending on this answer, the bends is still something you have to worry about. The bends are not good. And even if you have water breathing, that's not taking into account the pressure. Or sorry, I'm skipping ahead. In the sense that, okay, congrats, you can now breathe water. You can't colonize the whole ocean. Not to mention this only lasts 24 hours, but that's still great for a long-term dive or even setting up a separate location. And it also comes to the question of, do verbal components still work underwater? Does water breathing allow verbal? If silence blocks that, does the noise underwater still count? Does it need to be specifically with air? Like, can you still expel that in bubbles, or is the water enough to stop the verbal components from properly syncing correctly, similar to silence? And for that sake, can any spell be cast underwater? because a kind of equivalent spell in Starfinder avoids this question by having I think it's called Personal Atmosphere, or I might be mixing that up with Starfields. But the whole idea with the Starfinder one, you make a bubble around your head. So you have your own, personal atmosphere. You have your oxygen around you, you can actually speak into it. Even if the sounds don't leave it, they're still around you. Sound can travel through water, but it's garbled. Do verbal components only matter if it's just what you said, physically with your mouth? Does it need to be the proper noise and tune? Most of the time, that's how it's usually ruled, so the fact you're not on the surface or in a medium that can use that, like if you put a sock in someone's mouth, or you flooded their mouth with water, can they even say anything that fast? Is there stuff in the way? Which then ripples out to, can any underwater creature cast anything? I can't think of any immediate stat block. Well, no, I can. But even outside of that casting of verbal components, the question of the bends is a good one. Because if you still have oxygen in you I don't assume you're exhaling everything when you begin to head down and then are water breathing. Is the water taking the space of everything in your... do you come to the surface just needing a massive breath of air because you lost it all when underwater? Now let's say, world building wise, a civilization is trying to make use of this. We still run into world building issues of going into the water because water breathing is not the only issue of going underwater. But first, the pearl diving example, or any short-term diving or heading down to wrecks, usual, if we're just counting real life, normal human can head about to... I loosely checked the math on this, this was with equipment, but down to 60 meters, I think? It's the distance. I'm not a professional diver or anything. I try to stay away from the ocean, if anything. Which is a good amount. But the ocean's still a lot bigger. And it leaves the question of things like Sahagin, or resistances, or stone skin, or... okay. Pressure. Pressure is what I'm getting at. Anywhere a bit deeper, you run into issues. Short term and shallower terms wise, still 60 meters, that's not that bad. You can do underwater mining, flooded tunnels, you have 24 hours of breathable water-ish. Well, okay. No, if you're doing underwater mining, and there's things in the water that are floating there, especially if you're mining, you're gonna be kicking up a lot of silt, or dirt, or dust, or rocks. Breathing that in is not the water. Because this is water breathing, and it's allowing you to breathe underwater. You're still theoretically intaking things. That means as well, similar to if someone just threw a cloud of detritus and junk in the air, and if you breathe that all in, that's not going to be good for you. So you'll still run into issues that way. But basically anything that you'd use diving in now, it's relatively fixed. Because instead of a tank, you have this spell. It's just the other physical hazards and environment you got to worry about. Not even touching on the things there. Oh my god, the number of things that could be there. Not even just talking real life, but this is you're running a fantasy setting. Yeah, there's things like the Kraken, Leviathans, Aboliths are getting a bit closer to the point I'm about to make. Do you know how many monsters there are in the Monster Manual that just occupy on the surface? Or the things you can find in the Underdark? What do you think's in the trenches of a world that has the Underdark? Not to mention Underdark oceans. Entire cave systems that are flooded from ceiling to floor. The Sunless Sea is a fun theme. Honestly, that'd make a pretty neat setting. For a D&D game, I mean. Honestly, Call of Cthulhu might fit a bit more. Blades in the dark and the hideout and cruise your ship? Anywho, got distracted with that. Water breathing. Going deep is the issue, but basically, the fact that this allows for anything modern divers can do is fantastic, but not revolutionary. Underwater salvage, that's pretty decent, only to the range of 130 feet. Pearl diving, I'm not sure how you could do fishing, any more fishing than just on a boat with a big net or spears from a distance. Military applications wise, woo. I mean, similar to the diving one, except now you don't have to worry about the kit of a diving suit or a tank. You could 100% have, from the first Pirates of the Caribbean, that entire scene of the crew walking up from the beach line, just up from the water, or near the end of the film, when they're walking underneath to then climb up the ship. Yeah, there won't be skeletons. I mean, you could even do that now with undead in D&D. But you get my point, you can do it with other things. The reason I brought up the bends question as well earlier was even with the depth of about 60 meters, 130 feet-ish, those are the things I saw briefly looking up diving. If you still need to worry about the bends, that'll still throw in a bit of more practical problems or applications or problems that modern diving still runs into that just being able to breathe water still won't fix. Yes, this lasts 24 hours, not concentration. Dispel Magic is now one of the most dangerous spells here, if you can still cast that underwater. Again, imagine if you're a big boss fight underwater, current sunken Sahagin city, and then one Sahagin priest casts Dispel Magic. It's not going to affect the whole group, because no one's concentrating on it, but that one person who can't breathe anymore, that's not good. It's a similar vulnerability to a diving suit, that if like one thing is broken or someone managed to shoot a tank or slice a wire, or a hose or tube in this account. That's kinda it unless they can get another source of oxygen or someone can run over and cast this again, which they can. 30 feet away, one action. Not the worst, but that is consuming an entire 3rd level spell slot again. Or not again, but consuming one. But also to the continuous casting, if you can cast verbal components underwater. Which I assume most people rule it if you can breathe it because it's simple and allows for underwater stuff like that. It'd be entertaining to see a setting that did it that way though, where verbal components just didn't work underwater. But if you can. There's a theoretical idea of having an entire group of people just continuously cast this over and over and over and over again. And in shallow areas, you probably could. It'd be a weird industry. But with a small enough population, someone dedicated to just continuously ritual casting this, you could have just an underwater town in a small area. 130-foot depth. Though the other weird thing to keep in mind is the pressure and buoyancy, even while it's not crushing, it is still present. You float. I'm not sure if you've been in water. The part of that is the oxygen you have, so I guess if you were breathing again, if you are entirely replacing with water, oh god, I don't know. I'm not a diver. Would you sink? Would buoyancy be an issue at that point? Well, I guess with everything else around you. No, that's because the oxygen. But you could have small areas that, yeah, you need water breathing to pass through or to live in for a brief moment, or a small outpost underwater to see if any ships are coming into a harbor, or entire teams of siege equipment that are underwater specifically to stab up into vessels coming in. You can have a dwarven hold or a gatehouse or an entire castle that there is no gate. Really, there's nothing on the surface. There's an entire flooded cave system you can travel through, and all the guards have water breathing already on them. You don't. Some kind of dispel sigil or ward there, storing things underwater because you know you can reliably get to it with this spell, and everyone else who doesn't have water breathing, for example, it's gonna have a difficult time. And 3rd level's getting around the rarity angle. Less than 1st or 2nd, but still relatively achievable. Question is, at that point then, who would pick it up? Not just player-wise, because I know a lot of players will sleep or just skip past this, unless they are in an ocean campaign specifically, because they're going to be around water a lot, and that's kind of exactly the point. Even NPC-wise, they're probably not going to have this unless they are around water a lot. But those that are probably going to find ways to exploit this. Mainly because you could, again, if you have people around the clock and you can cast it underwater, you can have entire small outposts underwater. 130-foot depth. Ambushes that just walk up onto shoreline, sieges that take place both on castle ramparts, docks, outside, and also underneath the waves to stop ships, or those other invading forces using water breathing coming in from the ocean. You could also have a submarine. You need to have it buoyant to a certain level, but you now don't need to make it pressured. You don't need to have it to the point that people can breathe on the inside, because you could just have the crew with water breathing and some kind of underwater platform that just moves and has siege equipment tied to it. What siege equipment would work under those in that environment? I don't know, but you could. The thing is with water breathing, and what a lot of these questions have been tied to, ties into a lot of any other ocean-based or water-breathing creature or race like Triton, Sahagin, anything else that just happened to be thrown in with Ghost of Saltmarsh. Because the questions brought up with that is, okay, it doesn't work like the surface. And not in the sense like the Underdark doesn't. The Underdark at least still has, you know, an up and down. Sure, there's stone in every direction, but your feet are still planted. Because even if you based yourself on the ground, which in an underwater, water-breathing society might not, they might have entire, like, slightly buoyant, buoyed buildings, because who needs supports? And then everything would be flying. Who needs stairs? You don't. You can just swim. Maybe there's specific weighted equipment to bring yourself down. Lynx metal boots. And everything else around you. Walls are useless underwater. Really? Because you can just swim over them. Like, even with those underwater outpost examples, that was more to stop ships that are going above you. That's not a wall you're placing up. You have some kind of siege equipment or mechanism to stab up. A version of Archimedes, like harbor hooks. I forget what they're called. They're meant to, like, tip ships over. But underwater society-wise as well, like, it's not even just the people that are also invading this way, potentially. It's the animals. Or, in this case, the monsters, which, man, the monster manual, and even Saltmarsh just didn't touch on it enough, is like, you could have a whole series of campaigns in an underwater environment, especially if you have underwater humanoid races, and never touch the surface. But just because we are also land creatures, and we write for land creatures, because we get those. There's oxygen, we understand those stories, we understand how they think, we understand some of the problems they face, and how other creatures respond there. Even in real life, we don't know the full depths of the ocean. Well, not in the literal sense of depth in this case, but you get what I mean. You could go so wild, and more than just squid. Because yes, that's really cool, tentacled, really just doesn't have anything like it, but there's a lot of other creepy things in the ocean you could run with. I mean, we already have things like the owl bear, griffin, hippogriff. Those are quite simple, just mixing two different animals. Do that with fish! Or go a weird route and start mixing some, like, flying or other surface animals with fish. The seahorse that has actual, like, fins and is a horse on the front. Like, that's a whole topic on its own. I've definitely taken this on too long, and we've kind of gone off topic from the spell water breathing, but that's because just the ability to breathe underwater changes quite a lot, and there's still other environmental issues. That doesn't just, oh, you can build kingdoms in the ocean. Not quite. Still useful. Creative uses as well. Again, just locking off certain points to kind of requiring it to actually get there. Entire populations that are just hidden away just off the shoreline. And some of the underwater environments that just haven't been brought up too much or explored too much in some of these modules. Anywho, this is a very, very tangential episode. No, this is an episode full of tangents. We got off topic. But even with being off topic, in the spirit of this spell, what are some other, like, interesting, not thought of exploits? Because thinking in a 3D space, underwater, some of those environments, what are complications, benefits that you can see to having this? Write them down below, because just being able to breathe water and how potentially it works affects a lot. But then also not because of the environment, which is where the other questions came from, at 9 out of 10. Because, wow, 24 hours, not concentration, one action if you do need to actually cast it quickly, 3rd level, not that bad access-wise, and a ritual. 10 creatures. You can affect so many people that way. Like, those outposts can be pretty decent if you're just consistently round the clock casting it, even just as a ritual. And if it does get rid of the bends, allows for spell casting, those are questions that can come up. The 9 is namely because it's only useful for getting around or in water, so that cuts off about a good chunk of the planet. It's just not useful in... there is also something I forgot to touch upon, which... I forget which episode of Critical Role, but it's the whole idea of like, oh, if the air is poisonous, get a bucket of water, cast a water breathing, and dip your head in it. It's a possible solution, especially depending on how the spell works. But, yeah, 9 out of 10.